April 28, 1945. Near the town of Merkers, deep in the Thuringian forest, a bitter wind carried the scent of diesel and damp stone through the mouth of an abandoned salt mine. American troops from the 3rd U.S. Army, mud-caked, weary, and wide-eyed, approached the darkness with their rifles ready. The war was ending, but the ground beneath their boots still whispered secrets. Lieutenant William A. Campbell adjusted his helmet strap and peered into the yawning mine entrance. The air coming out was cool, dry, and smelled faintly of something metallic. Behind him, a convoy of olive-drab trucks idled, headlights cutting thin beams through the fog. A few GIs joked nervously, others smoked in silence. Everyone knew the rumors. The Nazis were hiding something down here. Gold, article, maybe even the remnants of their failed Reich. Let's see what they thought they could keep from us, Campbell muttered, signaling forward. A team of engineers moved in first, flashlights bobbing like fireflies against the mine's black walls. The tunnel yawned wider as they descended, thick wooden supports groaning under the weight of the mountain above. Inside, the soldiers found stacks of crates sealed with wax, canvas rolls tied in bundles, and metallic glints beneath layers of dust. The first pry bar slipped under a crate lid, and with a sharp crack, the seal broke. A moment later, a gloved hand brushed away straw padding, and the beam of a flashlight caught something that made everyone stop breathing. A gold frame, ornate, heavy. Inside it, faded but unmistakable, the delicate brushwork of Rembrandt. Jesus, whispered Private Harris. They really did it. Word spread fast. Down the tunnel, men began opening crates one after another. Vermeers, Rubens, Da Vinci's. Statues wrapped in linen, gold bars stamped with swastikas, bags of coins and jewelry. A soldier found a crate filled entirely with wedding rings, thousands of them, gleaming under a single bulb that flickered overhead. Campbell called in his commanding officer at once. Within hours, General George S. Patton himself arrived, boots echoing on the salt floor, eyes darting from painting to painting. This, he said quietly, isn't just treasure. This is everything they stole from civilization. Outside, the gray April sky hung heavy over the mine. Trucks lined up to haul the crates out one by one, engines rumbling through the valley. Local civilians gathered near the road, whispering, pointing, crossing themselves. They knew what was hidden here, and for many, it was the proof of all they'd lost. As night fell, the soldiers set up lamps and guarded the entrance. Some leaned on their rifles, staring at the endless stream of gold and art rolling up from the depths. In the silence between the engines, the only sound was the rustle of canvas and the slow creak of wooden crates being lifted toward the surface. What began as a simple reconnaissance mission was quickly becoming one of the most extraordinary discoveries of the war. A vault of stolen beauty, locked away by men who believed they would rule forever. The discovery at Merkers was only the beginning. What Campbell and his men had stumbled upon was not a mere stockpile. It was a vault connected to a much larger operation that had been unfolding for years across occupied Europe. As news of the find reached higher command, intelligence officers began tracing the origins of each crate, decoding the ledgers scrawled in German handwriting, and mapping out a network of theft that stretched from Paris to Krakow. The Nazis had plundered the continent with surgical precision. The Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, ERR, Hitler's art-looting task force, had seized private collections, museums, and entire libraries under the guise of cultural protection. But the truth was simpler. They wanted to own beauty, to claim the soul of Europe itself. Paintings by Renoir, Van Gogh, and Michelangelo were stripped from walls, catalogued, and marked with the Reichsadler. Destined for Hitler's Dream Museum in Linz, Austria, the so-called Führer Museum. As the Allies advanced in early 1945, the Nazi regime scrambled to hide its treasures. Trainloads of stolen art, gold, and currency were sent south and east, buried in mines, bunkers, and caves. One of these convoys, a heavily guarded train leaving from Alt-Aussee, carried masterpieces so valuable they could have rebuilt nations. But by April, the Reich was collapsing, and the train never reached its intended sanctuary. It was diverted, abandoned, and sealed away in the mountains of Austria. In the weeks that followed Merkers, American intelligence intercepted reports from locals who'd seen another train, larger, darker, and more mysterious, disappear into the tunnels near Alt-Aussee. Rumors spread quickly among Allied ranks. A ghost train filled with gold and art, hidden by SS units as the war crumbled around them. Major Robert Posey and Captain Lincoln Kirstein, members of the Monuments, Fine Arts, and Archives section, the Monuments men, were dispatched to investigate. Both men were trained artists before the war, and both understood what was at stake. They'd seen towns reduced to rubble and cathedrals gutted by fire. But the thought of Europe's cultural history erased forever haunted them more than any battlefield. Posey stared at a captured map inside his command jeep, tracing a finger along a winding rail line into the Austrian Alps. "If this is real," he said to Kirstein, "we're not just saving art. We're saving memory." Kirstein nodded quietly. Outside, the snow was melting. Rivers running fast with spring thaw. Every mile closer to Alt-Aussee brought them nearer to Hitler's final attempt to bury his stolen empire. May 3rd, 1945. The Austrian Alps loomed ahead, snow-dusted peaks rising above valleys, still echoing with distant artillery. Major Posey and Captain Kirstein traveled with a small detachment of armored scouts, weaving through switchback roads that cut across crumbling villages. The air was thin, filled with the scent of pine and smoke from the last dying fires of the Reich. By now, word of Hitler's death in Berlin had spread across the front. Some German units had surrendered, others were still fighting in pockets of fanatic resistance. But Posey's mission wasn't to chase soldiers. It was to find what those soldiers had buried. Locals whispered about a train, a dark one, that had entered the mountain near Alt-Aussee weeks earlier. Some said it was blown up inside to prevent capture. Others claimed it still sat sealed behind dynamite-choked tunnels. In the tavern at Bad Ischl, an old railway worker named Otto confessed to having seen the cargo himself. It was no ordinary shipment, he told Kirstein, his hands trembling as he spoke. Crates marked with black eagles. Paintings covered in cloth. The SS said it was the Führer's private collection. Armed with Otto's directions, the Americans moved toward the mine entrance at dawn. The narrow road led to a mouth in the rock, half concealed by trees and barbed wire. A sentry post stood abandoned. Scattered shells and tire tracks hinted that the guards had fled in a hurry. A single sign hung crookedly over the tunnel's gate. Bergwerk gesperrt. Mine closed. Posey ordered his men forward. "Keep your eyes open," he said. "If this place is what we think it is, it'll be worth more than any gold vault." The first steps inside were claustrophobic. Cold air pressed down, carrying the stale scent of oil and rust. Flashlights swept over rails that vanished into the dark. Then, as they advanced, beams of light caught metal shapes glinting beneath tarps, train cars, dozens of them, each sealed tight. Corporal Jennings climbed onto one and knocked. The echo that returned was hollow, heavy. With crowbars and picks, they pried open a door. Canvas-wrapped bundles spilled out like bodies. Posey unrolled one, and a burst of color flashed in the lamplight, figures dancing across a storm of brushstrokes. Matisse. Another crate revealed Michelangelo sketches, then a Vermeer, then a Rodin bust. Kirstein stared in silence. "They tried to bury the world's soul," he whispered. Further inside, soldiers found explosives wired to the tunnel supports, timed charges, enough to collapse the entire chamber. Someone had clearly intended to destroy the art rather than let it fall into enemy hands. But the detonators were missing. Later reports would reveal that Austrian miners, ordered to carry out the demolition, had sabotaged it, refusing to erase centuries of culture for a dying dictator. For the first time, Posey allowed himself to exhale. "Looks like conscience won a battle after all," he murmured. As the sun set outside, the Americans radioed their command. "Train located. Cargo intact." The message rippled through Allied headquarters like electricity. The war might have been nearly over, but this was victory on a different front, not just in territory or politics, but in civilization itself. By the time reinforcements arrived at the Alt-Aussee tunnels, the scene had transformed from an eerie mystery into a fever of discovery. Dozens of soldiers, engineers, and curators gathered at the mouth of the mine, their boots sinking into the thawing mud of the Alpine spring. The monument's fine arts and archives officers, the monument's men, had become the stewards of Europe's rebirth. Captain Kirstein and Major Posey walked through the maze of train cars with growing reverence. Each crate they opened revealed a fragment of human genius. Raphael's Madonna of the Chair, missing since 1943. Michelangelo's Bruges Madonna, its marble face serene even after years in darkness. Thousands of priceless works catalogued, hidden, almost lost to greed and madness. Behind them, photographers from the Signal Corps documented every piece. Flashbulbs popped, casting momentary bursts of brilliance against the rock walls. The soldiers joked quietly, but even the youngest privates seemed to recognize the gravity of the moment. They weren't just moving crates. They were rescuing history itself. Kirstein paused in front of a dusty wooden box, smaller than the rest. He brushed away dirt to reveal a hand-painted label. Kunstmuseum Wien, 1567. He cracked it open and stared at the delicate portrait of a child by Hans Holbein. Its blue eyes still gleamed, untouched by time. "You think about all the bombs, the bodies, the cities burned," he said softly to Posey. "And somehow this survives." Nearby, a group of engineers set up winches to hoist heavier sculptures out of the mine. The smell of oil mixed with the cold mineral air as cables groaned and gears turned. Every lift was an act of defiance against what the Reich had tried to erase. News of the recovery spread fast. Journalists arrived within days, trudging through snow and mud to photograph the mine entrance. The story ran in Allied papers under headlines like "Nazis' Secret Treasure Found" and "Millions in Looted Art Saved in Austrian Caves." But to the men who stood inside that mountain, the value wasn't counted in gold or francs. It was in brushstrokes, marble, and memory. When General Eisenhower heard of the discovery, he ordered that senior commanders visit the site personally. "We're not only fighting to free the people," he said. "We're fighting to free their culture." On May 10th, Eisenhower, along with Generals Bradley and Patton, arrived at Alt-Aussee. They stepped into the dim tunnels, escorted by Kirstein and Posey. Patton, normally brash and loud, walked silently. He stopped before the Bruges Madonna, hands behind his back, eyes reflecting the lamplight. "You can destroy armies," he said at last, "but not this." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady, blanketing the mountain. For the first time in years, the art of Europe was safe. Not because of walls or borders, but because men who understood its worth had risked everything to save it. Still, one question remained. How had the Nazis assembled so much? And what had they truly hoped to achieve with it? Years before the Allies ever reached the Alps, the idea of hoarding art had begun as something far more deliberate. A vision of immortality. In 1938, after the annexation of Austria, Adolf Hitler stood inside Vienna's Kunsthistorisches Museum and stared up at the towering canvases of Rubens and Titian. To those around him, he spoke not as a soldier, but as a failed painter who believed destiny had finally vindicated him. He called it the Führer Museum, and it was to be the greatest art museum the world had ever seen. Built in Linz, his childhood city, it would house the cultural spoils of his empire, masterpieces rescued from the chaos of a Europe he intended to reshape. To Hitler, this was not theft, it was divine right. "I will create a sanctuary for all true art," he once told architect Hermann Giesler. "The world will come to Linz as they once came to Rome." To achieve that vision, Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Göring unleashed teams of art historians, curators, and SS officers to strip Europe clean. From the Louvre's silent galleries to Jewish homes in Paris, Brussels, and Krakow, paintings vanished overnight. Private collections, like those of the Rothschilds, were catalogued, crated, and stamped with the Black Eagle of the Reich. Even religious relics, manuscripts, and church bells were seized. The Reich wasn't content to rule territory. It sought to own civilization's soul. As the war dragged on, the Führer Museum became Hitler's obsession. Even while Berlin burned, he still dictated lists of acquisitions. Each piece was recorded, insured by decree, and destined for his grand hall in Linz, a project that never rose beyond blueprints and dreams. By 1944, Allied bombers were shattering Germany's cities, and Hitler's empire was collapsing. Yet, in the mountain towns of Austria and Bavaria, SS convoys worked through the night, sealing art into mines, salt caves, and train cars. Hitler had ordered it done personally. If the Reich fell, the art was to be hidden or destroyed before surrender. "If we lose this war," he declared, "this heritage will perish with us." And so the paintings traveled. Michelangelo's Madonnas, Vermeer's Astronomer, even the Ghent altarpiece, packed into crates and loaded onto trains that snaked through bombed-out valleys under blackout conditions. The loot trains became moving tombs of beauty. But the irony was bitter. In his hunger to enshrine civilization, Hitler had condemned it to darkness. What he believed would be his immortal monument instead became his epitaph, sealed in the cold heart of a mountain. As the monument's men catalogued each recovered piece, they began to understand the scope of his obsession. Over 15,000 artworks, hundreds of tons of gold, and countless artifacts, all stolen in the name of purity, preserved by the courage of those who refused his final orders. And though Hitler's armies lay in ruins, his last dream, the museum that would outlive him, now belonged to those who had defeated him. The summer of 1945 arrived quietly in Austria. The gunfire had faded, replaced by the hum of generators and the clatter of typewriters as Allied command transitioned from combat to reconstruction. But for the monuments men stationed in the Alpine valleys, the war wasn't over. It had only changed form. Their enemy was now decay, theft, and time itself. In Salzburg, a commandeered monastery became the central collecting point. A sanctuary where recovered art from across the Reich was gathered, identified, and prepared for restitution. The once silent halls echoed with the careful steps of curators, archivists, and soldiers carrying crates with gloved precision. Every wall became a catalog of Europe's loss. Da Vinci's beside Botticelli's, icons beside impressionists, each tagged with a number and the story of a family that once cherished it. Captain Kirstein worked late into the nights, poring over ledgers and coded documents salvaged from SS offices. Some lists were neat and bureaucratic, others frantic and incomplete. One entry, scribbled in red pencil, read simply, Train 248, Alt Aussie, final shipment. Führer's approval. He exhaled, closing the file. That train had been found. But how many others were still buried, forgotten beneath collapsing tunnels? Major Posey joined him, holding a faded photograph, one of the Bruges Madonna being carried out of the mine weeks earlier. "You realize," he said, "if the miners had obeyed orders, all of this would have been rubble." Kirstein nodded slowly. They defied him when it mattered most. Meanwhile, Allied investigators interrogated captured Nazi officials about the looting operation. Some, like Hermann Göring, boasted of their stolen collections with twisted pride. Others feigned ignorance. But the paper trail was undeniable. The Nazis had systematized plunder with the same precision they used for warfare. In Nuremberg, as evidence was assembled for the trials, photographs of the art caches were displayed before the judges. Visual proof of how ideology had turned into avarice. When Göring was shown a photograph of the treasures recovered from Alt Aussee, his smirk faltered. "It was all meant for Germany," he muttered. But to the tribunal, it was clear. This was not Germany's art. It was the world's. The moral reckoning extended beyond the courtroom. Across Europe, survivors of the Holocaust came forward with fragments of memory. A portrait above a piano, a painting once hanging in a study, seeking to reclaim what was theirs. Some succeeded. Many never found their pieces again. But the effort itself was a quiet form of justice. By late 1946, thousands of artworks had been returned to their rightful homes. Others remained in storage, protected and preserved, waiting for owners who would never come back. The monuments men began to disperse. Artists returning to studios, curators to museums, soldiers to families. Yet each carried the same unspoken thought. They hadn't just recovered paintings. They had resurrected meaning. For the Allied soldiers who had fought their way through bombed-out cities, the discovery of the loot train symbolized something larger than victory. It proved that while tyrants could burn libraries and loot cathedrals, they could never truly destroy what made humanity endure. Its ability to create, to remember, to rebuild. And so, in the ruins of a continent, a quiet redemption began. Some lists were neat and bureaucratic, others frantic and incomplete. One entry, scribbled in red pencil, read simply, Train 248, Alt Aussee. Final shipment. Führer's approval. He exhaled, closing the file. That train had been found. But how many others still lay hidden in forgotten tunnels or beneath collapsed salt mines? Weeks passed, and the magnitude of their discovery spread through the Allied ranks. Newspapers called them the rescuers of Europe's soul. Yet the monument's men themselves remained humble, uneasy with glory. As Kirstein wrote in a letter home, "We did not win the war, but perhaps we have saved what made it worth fighting for." In the years that followed, the process of restitution became its own odyssey. Some works traveled thousands of miles back to the families who once owned them. Others were claimed by governments or museums. Each shipment out of the Salzburg collecting point was a small act of healing. Crates marked not with swastikas, but with hope. But many mysteries lingered. Entire shipments had vanished during the final weeks of the Reich. A handful of paintings, including Vermeer's The Concert, disappeared into private hands, never to be seen again. Rumors spread of buried caches in Bavarian forests and castles sealed by retreating SS units. For historians and treasure hunters alike, the legend of Hitler's art trains became a haunting echo of unfinished history. By the 1950s, Europe was rebuilding, cities rising from rubble, museums reopening their grand halls. The monuments men, now scattered across continents, watched as the art they had rescued returned to public view. In Florence, crowds wept at the unveiling of restored Renaissance frescoes. In Paris, the Louvre reopened its galleries to the sound of children's laughter. And in Austria, the Alto See mine was sealed and turned into a monument, a silent cathedral to the madness and mercy of humankind. Visitors who descended into its tunnels could still see the markings on the walls, the wooden braces that once protected the world's masterpieces from annihilation. A plaque near the entrance read, "Here, in the darkest days, beauty was saved from destruction." Captain Kirstein returned once more before his death, standing in that cold, echoing space. Dust motes swirled like ghosts in the beam of his flashlight. "You can bury art," he whispered, "but you can't bury the truth." And that, in the end, was Hitler's final defeat. Not by armies or bombs, but by the enduring spirit of creation he sought to extinguish. Decades later, the story of the Altau See train had taken on a life of its own. Documentaries, books, and lectures recounted the miraculous survival of Europe's cultural treasures. Yet few truly grasped the human tension behind the crates. For the men and women who had labored in the shadows, soldiers turned curators, scholars turned sentries, their memories were vivid. The creak of the mine doors, the smell of damp salt, the nervous glance at every corridor for lurking danger. Visitors to the Altau See mine today walk carefully on wooden planks, tracing the steps of those who saved history. Audio guides narrate the battles fought not with rifles, but with knowledge, patience, and unshakable moral courage. Each painting returned, each sculpture restored, is a testament to resilience, a signal that even in the heart of devastation, art and the human spirit cannot be fully conquered. Historians debate the full scale of the Nazis' looted empire, but the recovered trains serve as enduring evidence. A vivid reminder that tyranny can seize territory, armies can occupy cities, but they cannot destroy the soul of a culture without effort, vigilance, and courage. The stolen paintings, once crammed into freight cars and hidden in salt mines, now hang in museums, their colors as bright as the hope that rescued them. And so, when you gaze upon a Vermeer or a Titian, remember that its survival was not inevitable. It was won through ingenuity, bravery, and a refusal to accept the annihilation of beauty. Hitler may have controlled armies, factories, and fear, but a train full of paintings safeguarded by those who believed in art's value, became an unlikely symbol of his final defeat.